Welcome to Internal Comms Pro, the podcast. This season, we are featuring experts who are on the field with you, helping you navigate the current world of internal communications.
Yeah, I think the big thing is where in past years it's been a lot about technology. I think what's really happening at the moment is a shift from a people perspective. I think there are core sets of questions that perhaps work separately for each business, but I think it's about diving deep and understanding who is your ideal staff member? What do they really look like?
While we often use this show to talk about internal communications, today we're shifting our focus to marketing. No, you didn't mishear. Our guest today, Anthony Perl, is director of a communications and marketing agency called CommTogether, and he'll be sharing his latest findings over this past year. While some of the examples you're about to hear today are from external marketing, you might be surprised to hear that the tactics being used, your company can also use to market internally. So let's dive in.
My name is Anthony Perl, and my business is CommTogether. We do branding, marketing, anything you like around that area.
Well, one of the pieces of feedback we got from our listeners is they wanted to hear folks that not only were passionate about internal communications, but that also had outside sort of expertise in marketing and external communications. So I appreciate you, hopping on the show and maybe sharing some things about the world of marketing that would tie into their work with internal communications. So let's just kind of, just jump right in and get started. If you wouldn't mind, how did you get involved in the world of communications?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? When you go back and you think of all of these things, and it really started for me. I don't know whether I asked for it or whether my parents gave it to me, but I remember being a small child. I think probably 6 or 7, and they gave me a build-it-yourself crystal radio set. And I remember, and I've still got it actually. And I built this crystal radio set, ran long wires out from my bedroom out the window to try and get all sorts of radio signals from around the world. And I was particularly fascinated with the cricket, being an Australian. And they used the commentary that they did, particularly out of the UK, was fascinating. Uh, at, Particularly in those days, they really used to do the idea of painting a picture, but they would talk about more than just the sport. They would talk about, what happened on the weekend, the cakes that were brought in for them to eat, and everything that was going on. And I was fascinated by that idea from the beginning of storytelling and painting a picture and being that person that could communicate with people. And I think it really took from there. I mean, still got a passionate love for cricket, but it really extended into general communications, and it led me down the path of working in radio and ultimately working in the corporate sector and the non-for-profit, and eventually opening my own business. And it's all been around that idea of communicating and storytelling and building the audience from there. And I think it really dates back to that 7-year-old boy sitting and listening to the cricket in the middle of the night on a crystal radio set that I built myself.
Well, and because you are on the other side, it is amazing because I'm in Kentucky right now, and we're getting ready to go into our spring and summer. And so to talk about this from just a global perspective, and with you being so sort of in tune with maybe what's trending globally in the world of marketing and communications that maybe our internal communicators might want to know about, things that you're seeing maybe with COVID and the opening of businesses. I don't know what's happening in Australia, but it seems like things are kind of getting back to normal here, or maybe a new normal. Tell me a little bit about, again, from your perspective and the seat that you're sitting in globally, what are some things that you're seeing that our listeners might need to be paying attention to or know about with the upcoming year?
Yeah, I think the big thing is where in past years it's been a lot about technology. I think what's really happening at the moment is a shift from a people perspective. There are a lot of people that are changing their lifestyle. I certainly know in Australia there's been a lot of people that have moved out of the city areas. And a lot of that has to do with the flexibility in work. I mean, what's fascinating for me is that personally, my business has operated from my home office and therefore remotely for 11 years now. So I'm very accustomed to working from home. But I know when I first started doing that, people were, how can you work from home? Now there's an expectation that you can work from home. And I think the big shift that's happened is that people are expecting that different kind of lifestyle, and it's affecting the way they think about things. I recently had a discussion with a whole group of professional services oriented businesses, and the commonality was that people are not only thinking about those lifestyle changes, but their focus is much more short term than it's ever been. And they're having to fight this battle of having to get people to think in a much bigger picture again, because people are really worried about what's happening in the next month and not really focused on 5 and 10 years. And the interesting sort of subset of that from a business point of view is of course we've seen a lot of people that have attempted to go out on their own.
Well, and I think it's important for our listeners. I think it's helpful for them to listen to you talk about this, because then they might feel certain things are going on, but if they can speak to it, even to leadership, of what you just said, like, hey, these are big changes that are happening and this is why we're feeling this way. When you talk about people craving human interaction and what community really means, and they're fatigued with Zoom, and quite frankly, our listeners are fatigued, right? What else are we going to do now to create human interaction with hybrid work schedules? How does your company, do they help communicators sort of figure this out? How do you choreograph and make people feel human interaction through the communication channels that they have? How do they do that and keep it fresh?
Yeah, I think there's a few layers that needs to come about. And I think we've seen a lot of people shifting jobs. And I think a lot of that has to do with going from the idea that a job is just about what the work is and where that work can lead you to a much more core understanding of values. And I think when you are embedded within an organization, the values that you share both with the organization itself and the other staff members becomes more and more critical. And I think that's where the definition of community starts to come in as well. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I think that really you need to see how those people are interacting on a different level. I know certainly for me, my team is remote, and we make an effort to try and interact. There is a shared sense of values and direction of the business, but indeed we also recognize that that human interaction for us is actually never really possible in terms of physical co-location. So we have to deal with it in other ways, which I think is interesting. And then you have to look and say, well, if you are not going to get your human interaction from the workplace, you get it from somewhere else, which is where that definition of community comes in. But I think that there's a recognition that needs to happen from business leaders and saying that idea of what they used to term as social or team bonding and all of those kinds of things. I think the way that dynamic has to work is different, and what people are looking for is much more inward than it is that kind of, hey, let's just do those team bonding exercises and spend a day somewhere and do all that kind of stuff and bang some drums or whatever that might be. I think that shift is really going to change. And I think it's about finding that, allowing people to find that sense of community outside of work as well.
This is so important because I think we feel it and we see it, and again, our audience is full of internal communicators and people who are now, the our listeners are now evolving into people experience roles, and now they're responsible for that, and the whole way we communicate is a part of the employee experience. And so they're they're feeling symptoms, I think, of lack of shared values now that you point this out, but they might not know why. So if there's friction in some of the why they're not as engaged in the events or why people aren't showing up, if the company it's so good if the company has not stated, hey, these are our values, and it might be the role of the internal communicator to step up and do this and play this role. these are the shared values. This becomes the backstop. And how are these manifesting in behaviors that the company thinks are good? What does this value look like, and what does it not look like? It would be valuable, I think, for our listeners to even lead that, and then how does that can then become the backstop of, well, this is why we're communicating, and why we're when we're communicating, because it aligns with, to your point, we're not going to do happy hours at whatever, because we've learned that most of our folks have, ball games at this time, or whatever it might be. I just think you're putting it's so eloquent how you're saying it, because I think a lot of our listeners feel the symptoms of when you don't do the work of the shared values. It shows up in their communication.
Absolutely. And I think that the fundamentals of marketing are often completely missed by businesses. They, kind of brush it off as saying, yeah, we've got a mission, vision, values. We kind of looked at our purpose, and we did that a few years ago. And maybe we tick a box once a year where we think about it for 30 seconds and we go, yeah, that's fine. But in fact, it's an invaluable exercise that should be spread across the company. And you should recognize when there isn't a value alignment. You might have some fantastic people who are enormously capable at what they do, but if the values are not aligned, then ultimately it's not going to, end as well as it should. And those, open lines of communication are incredibly important. And sometimes it may need to be, I think, is saying, well, what's the exit strategy? If we find out that we have people who are really great at their job and we love them, but clearly they're not mixing with the rest of the other people that well because of the value misalignment, then you need to have an exit strategy for them, and you need to be communicating that, in a very open and honest way. I recall having a conversation with her when I was employed many years ago, and I was working with the CEO quite closely, and we had I'd achieved an enormous amount in the job, and I'd gone away on holidays, and I came back and I had this revelation that I didn't think there was anything more that I could offer the business. I was really at that point where I said, look, I can keep doing the same, and I know we'll kick some goals, but I need a new challenge. And that was part of my value misalignment, I guess, with the business at that time, in that I knew there wasn't an opportunity for me to progress. I knew that me wanting to work more remotely and do those things wasn't going to wash well with the business, so that it was time to have an open and honest conversation that I did with the CEO. And I said, this is where I'm at. This is where I want to do. This is the person that I believe can replace me within the business. I would like some time to try and find the next role and outside, and give me that flexibility to do that, and equally to train this person to take over from me when that time's right. Let's set a time period to do that. Let's keep it on the down low. And we managed that process really well, and it worked beautifully. But I think that there aren't many people that are prepared to have those open conversations, be it the person that's employed or be it the leader in the business.
We'll continue our conversation with Anthony after a brief message from our sponsor, Circle. One of the easiest ways to strategically shift your department is through figuring out what metrics matter and tracking them. Our sponsor, Circle, knows that each IC department are as unique as snowflakes, and that's why Circle Broadcast Suite provides communicators with custom shareable dashboards. Use your unique content and channel analytics to provide department insights to your team and higher ups. Head over to circle.com/ICP. That's CERKL.com/ICP to learn more about how you can broadcast your employees' stories in an impactful way. Welcome back. Now that we've established the value of marketing internally, we'll dive into more of the specifics, such as developing and understanding your employee personas. What are those? Let's jump back in and find out. Well, again, this is such a great place for our listeners to get a quick win, and I think to raise their agency. Particularly, a lot of companies have mission, vision, and values. You ask the employees, what is it? They don't even know. And so I think that's the connection from a internal marketing when our listeners are trying to create and communicate the brand of, the company internally and externally. When you talk about the fundamentals of marketing, what are some fundamentals of marketing that an internal communicator could use that would apply nicely in the world of internal communication?
I mean, I think those ideas of mission, vision, values, um, why and purpose and personas, they're the cores of marketing, right? And the foundational elements. And they apply as much internally as they do externally. I mean, even the idea of personas, right? You should be building a persona or avatar, as they're being called now, for your staff. Are they matching up with those core values? And I think it is about expanding on what those values mean and also diving into purpose. I mean, commonly, as a from a marketing perspective, I often dive in with business owners and leaders. What is their purpose? What is their why? And I know this has kind of become a trendy area to look at, but I think it's so critical because those stories unwrap a whole lot of things. And I think whilst that's a great exercise for telling a story that's external, what's really interesting is doing the same thing with your staff. Why are they here? What do they really want? What does this mean to them? And I think digging deeper and deeper and getting to that point in that revelation is so important. I mean, I've heard it said around the why question is that you keep asking why until you get chills. Then you know you've reached your why. And I think doing that exercise with team members is also incredibly important because it reveals a lot about their values and what it means to them.
And the power of the communicator to be the storyteller to unlock that. I've heard the same thing on the why. It's ask it till you cry, till it brings tears to your eyes too. But with you to go back to and where you started on people wanting human interaction and meaning in their life for the internal communicator to unlock that in the employee, and then you can link it to this is how our values are being manifested. I mean, what a great thing. To go back to the personas, talk to me about how would I go about doing that maybe tactfully or tactically? Dive into a little bit. If I'm going to go do that, where do I start? How do I do it? I think this would be a key thing that our listeners could maybe do.
Yeah, I think there are core sets of questions that perhaps work separately for each business, but I think it's about diving deep and understanding who is your ideal staff member? What do they really look like? Because if you start from that foundation of your values, and so let's use, for example, family. Let's say celebrating family is a value. Then, the person that you might be looking for might be, for example, someone in their 40s who's married with children. And that's a very different look to saying, hey, we're really about being cutting edge. So that's more us, and maybe we need people in their 20s and 30s who are not quite there yet in that family space, as an example. So starting to build that idea of who they are, putting names to them, because I think that's also, and when you communicate internally, you want to make sure that you're reaching people at a level that suits them. I think too often in the past, we've come up with ideas that we think are really great to bring everyone together, and we haven't really thought about who those people are in the business. For example, I think there's a great divide between people who are introverted and extroverted. And often, particularly in team type stuff, we cater for the extroverts or push people to be extroverts, and we don't cater for those introverted people who are at least 50% of the population, if not more. And I think that when you fully understand what the person is like and you start planning, whether it's a communication piece, whether it's an activity, then you start thinking about, well, what would they actually like? If your typical, person is John and he's 45, he's got 2 children, he's happily married, he tends to be an introvert. He wants to progress in his career, but he's happy to take it slow. If that, you're starting to paint that picture of who John is, right? then when you say, well, we're planning this exercise, or we're wanting to do this, or, or we're wanting to find the right people to help on a particular project, then we think of John and go, is John the right person? And how many Johns do we have in the business? And do we have some, well, we have a Mary, and we have a a Joe, and we have a whole bunch of different kind of personas, and that enables them to really understand who are the right people in the right positions for the right roles. And I think it's really delving into that and understanding of what's right for the business as well. Because if you reveal this picture of, go back to John, who's an introvert and in his 40s, and you think, hang on, the values of the business are a little bit different. And we like John, going back to what I was saying before, and we like John a lot, but the business really needs to be moving here, and the values that we've created for the business really need to be this. And hang on, this isn't working. Alternatively, you can go back and say, John is right, and he values family. What are we doing about that? Do we wait for John to put up his hand and say, listen, I really want to go pick up the kids from school today? Or do we actually make it a company policy where we say, look, we're quite open to you picking up the kids from school. If it might be a shared environment, we'd prefer if you only did it 2 out of 3 days a week, or every second, you did it 5 days for every second week, or some kind of shared arrangement, whatever it might be that suits your business. But understanding that those things are important to John from his, when you've revealed his persona, enables you to create some things that are going to help him.
Well, and it's a great framework for our listeners to bring the values to life and to really play a great leadership role in holding people, the company accountable, bringing them to life, having them be communicated, pointing out, hey, if you got issues on your team, is there a misalignment of values? I want to go back. You said there's 4 questions. So it's, what are the values? What do they really look like? Was there 2 that I missed?
No, I think it's really, I think going from the values, it's not only what they look like, but it's how do they align, and then what are you going to do about it? I think that's the core thing. It's often things like values are this kind of, exercise that people go through, as I said before, and tick a box. But you have to actually see that they make sense, make them, play them out a little bit. If your value is communication, for example, which is also a common value that people have in a business, what does that actually mean? How does that actually play out? And communication, for example, is a two-way process. It's listening as well. And so are you actually listening to what your team actually, are you even asking them, what is it that we could do that would help you and make it easier for you to perform?
So would you say that if listeners are out there thinking about, all right, the big world of marketing, and I'm trying to communicate and develop the brand, and I'm also employee experience, it sounds like what you're saying is starting with the values is the cornerstone to anything that they're going to go do, whether it is the employee experience or developing the internal brand or developing the communication plan, that's the first place. And to don't make them just a couple words, dive into what those words mean and keep going. There's layers underneath those value words that are going to unlock things for them to make these things come to life and make the communication feel very authentic and almost act as a moral compass to the community, so that there is integrity there, that with the communication, the experience, and what the employees are actually experiencing.
Absolutely. And I think what's even more critical as a result of that exercise is to tell those stories. You see, if you think about it in the past, people were, given permission to, maybe work from home for a day, right? And what would happen would be is it'd kind of be on the down low. No one, shh, don't tell anyone, right? We don't want everyone doing this. But I think now it's about telling those stories and telling them both internally and externally, and how it's made a difference, because again, I'm using family because it's an easy one, right? But what do you celebrate about that? If internally that someone's family has had something significant happen to it, how do you celebrate that? Both for them personally, and also, is there a story to tell within the company that allow, and can be externally as well, because that value is what aligns people. And the real thing about storytelling is it's what we remember. And that's the problem sometimes with just a series of statements is they're a series of statements. But when you wrap a story or continue to wrap stories around it, and that's how I think how you reminding, often I think the internal communicator's idea of reminding people about things like values is to give them a piece of paper and stick it up on the wall or say, hey, it appears on their computer screen every time they turn it on. Like everyone just ignores that. The real trick is telling stories on an ongoing basis around those core values without necessarily saying that's what you're doing. That's the role of an internal communicator is to echo those different values and uncover those stories and tell them consistently. And as I said, sometimes they can be gold for external as well, because that's a really important thing to do. And I think that says a lot about a lot about a business, and being prepared to offer that publicly makes all of the difference. And we see that, that level of engagement. I mean, if you think about social media, what do most people click on and acknowledge and read? It's the personal stuff, right? We can put lots of stuff up there about how our businesses are going and all of these and offers and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, when you put up something that's a little bit more personal, whether it's about your pets, about food, about your children, about some activity that you went on, that's what's going to attract more interest, because we're interested in the stories. So why not utilize that same idea to celebrate the values that you have as a business internally, and indeed potentially use some of those externally, given the right permission from people.
At the heart of every internal communicator is a storyteller. The way you tell those stories, both externally and internally, affect your employees' morale. While technically it still is marketing for an IC Pro, it's being able to share your company's stories, thus connecting the head and the heart.
A huge thank you to Anthony for joining us on the podcast. If you'd like to connect with Anthony, you can find him as well as the resources we discussed in our show notes. Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective and proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. And don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.